Let's get started. So today's topic is gain sharing and gain tracking. We're going to learn what the difference between those are, as well as which consoles have those features available to them, and basically when they would typically be used. So let's dive right in and we'll learn all about them. So first of all, in order to understand gain tracking and gain sharing, we have to know the difference between gain and trim. So this might seem simple to some of you, but in case you don't know the difference, we're going to go over that quickly now. So first of all, gain, that's something that's applied to the analog signal. It's a boost or a cut applied to that signal before it's converted into digital so that it can be processed by a digital mixer. And more importantly, I would say, is that it's applied at the socket level. So if you were in my class, a few months ago, where I went over Allen and Heath terminology, we went over the difference between a socket and an input channel. And it's important to note what happens at the socket level of the signal processing chain and what happens at the input channel level. And you'll see why it's important that gain happens at the socket level. And we're going to go over that shortly. So trim, on the other hand, that's a digital adjustment. So it's after the signal is already converted to digital and it's processed by the digital engine. And that's it's similar to gain in the sense that you're boosting or reducing the level of the signal by a certain amount of decibels, but it's applied to a digital signal rather than the analog signal. And it's also important to note that this is applied at the input channel level, not at the socket level. And the reason that's important to note is because the same socket can be assigned to multiple input channels. So just take a look at this diagram at the bottom here. So we have a microphone on the left, and that's connected to an input socket. So that's a mic preamp. It could be on a D-Live mix rack. It could be on the back of a D-Live Surface. It could be on an SQ stage box or an Avantis or whatever it is. That's an input socket. And then on basically all of our consoles, you could take that same input socket and assign it to as many input channels as you want. So it's that same mic, that same preamp, but it's feeding different input channels within your console. And the reason it's important to know the difference between gain and trim and where they're happening is because if I were to adjust the gain at the input socket, that would affect all of the input channels that socket is assigned to. Whereas if I were to adjust the trim on one of those channels, it only affects that channel specifically. It doesn't affect the other input channel that it's assigned to, and it does not affect the actual input socket. So that's why it's really important to have in your mind where these things are happening, as well as what they are. It's important to know that gain happens on the analog signal and trim happens on digital, but even more importantly to me is where they're happening and what you're affecting by making that change. And it's also important to note that a digital signal like Dante or Waves or Maddie, if that's coming in to your console through a card, obviously that's only going to have a trim control because it's already digital by the time it reaches your console. So you don't have control over the analog gain in that case. So now that we know the difference between gain and trim, we can talk about gain tracking. And another way to say that is trim compensation, because it's a setting that would be enabled on the preamp section of an input channel. And each input channel has this setting that you can enable or disable individually. And basically, when two or more channels share the same input socket, the trim can automatically compensate on the input channel to any gain adjustments made at the socket. And so this is useful for situations where you have input sockets duplicated. So if you have front of house and monitor mix, if you have enough channels to spare, then you can usually duplicate each input socket and make kind of a split either internally within your console or to a second console. And so you have the same socket sharing multiple channels. And if there's an adjustment made to the gain at the preamp by one engineer who's mixing either front of house or monitors, you don't want that to also affect the other console's mix. And so when you make that change, you see my little animation in the bottom right. When an adjustment is made to the gain, when the gain is turned up, the trim automatically goes down. And when the gain goes down, the trim automatically goes up. And it compensates so that in the mix at the end, you don't really hear those differences made by the opposite engineer. And so just bringing back that diagram from before, this is when a change is made at the socket level. if your input channel has gain tracking enabled, then the trim will compensate. If it doesn't have gain tracking enabled, then you will hear those changes made at the input socket level, at the input channel level as well, because the compensation doesn't happen. Okay. And what we just looked at was, you could see it here behind this menu, gain tracking you can enable per channel, and that happens on the actual kind of processing menus for each of those individual channels. So you could either turn it on and off at each individual channel that you want that setting applied to, or if you want to kind of mass update it across several channels, you could do that as well. And on DLive, the way to do that is by opening the preamp section of the channel processing screen, and then hit that setup key, and that always reveals all kinds of hidden menus on DLive and Avantis as well. So hit that setup key and you'll see preamp options pop up. And if you tap on that, then here you will see a section where you can have a start and end channel and enable or disable gain tracking across that entire range of channels. So if you have the front of house person is working mainly with the actual analog preamp gain, and the monitor engineer is working mainly with trims because they don't want to interfere with each other, you can enable gain tracking on the monitor engineer's channels so that any adjustment to the gain made by the front of house engineer is not affecting the monitor engineer's mix. Another little menu that I'll talk about here is preamp on surface. So this goes back to what we were talking about with gain and trim. So basically, when you have a DLive surface or an Avantis, this is also something on SQ as well. You have surface controls. In this case, it's the encoders above the faders. Those can control the gain of the channel. But if you disable preamp on surface, then those encoders instead will by default control the trim of those channels. So if you're the engineer that's working mainly with trim rather than gain, then you could disable preamp on surface, and that way you'll have quick access to the trim control, because by default that's a gain control. So that's just a quick way to globally change that across the surface that you're currently on. So here's an example of how you would use gain tracking. So this is a multi-surface DLive configuration. So we have two DLive surfaces sharing the same mix engine. And when you set that up, you have one surface that's kind of your main surface that goes to the built-in GigaAce ports on the mix engine. And any kind of secondary surfaces would connect via a GigaAce card installed in the mix rack. And this goes to the built-in ports on the back of that surface. And so normally what you do in this case is you'd have the input sockets. So they're sharing these same 64 input sockets. And so like input channels 1 to 64 would use those input sockets, and then you duplicate them. So input socket 1 would also go to input channel 65, and 2 would go to 66, and all the way up to 128. And those channels would be duplicates, and they're used by, say, the monitor engineer. And so both consoles in this configuration, because they're both directly connected to the mix rack, both can actually control, they can access those preamp gain controls, but at the same time, you don't want them affecting each other's mix by adjusting the preamp gain. So if the monitor engineer says, whoa, the signal's way too hot for this, the bassist, I'm gonna turn down the gain on their channel, you don't want that to affect the front of house mix. So you would want gain tracking turned on so that they don't affect each other and there's compensation there. So yeah, a gain increase on one console would cause a trim decrease on the other, and vice versa. So now let's get into gain sharing. So what is that? So first of all, this is a DLive exclusive feature, at least for now. It's possible that they eventually add that to other consoles, but I don't know anything about that. And it was also only introduced in DLive firmware version 1.9. So you couldn't do this before version 1.9 firmware, and make sure you're updated if you do want to make use of this feature. And basically, it allows one DLive mix rack to control preamps on a second DLive mix rack. And that's something you could not do prior to firmware 1.9. If you had two mix racks in a digital split, then you could send like direct outs or tie lines over to the other system, but the second system won't have access to the actual preamp gain. They would just be working with trims at that point. But now with this new gain sharing feature in firmware 1.9, you can actually access the preamps even though you're on a secondary mix rack that doesn't have direct access to those preamps. Keep in mind that this works in Giga Ace or Fiber Ace splits only. So both mix racks need to have Giga Ace cards installed or Fiber Ace. So if you need a really long cable run between your two mix engines, then you could use Fiber Ace cards instead and run fiber, so get much longer cable runs in that case. The cards need to be installed in the mix racks for this to work. You have card slots in the back of your DLive Surface as well, but the gain sharing feature will not work under those circumstances. You have to use tie lines for your digital split. So when you have two mix racks and you want to share audio between them, there's two main ways to do that. And one way is using direct outs, which is at the input channel level. You're outputting all your input channels basically to the other console. But the other way is using tie lines, which is at the input socket level. You're splitting it at the socket. And in order for gain sharing to work, you have to do that split at the socket level, which means you have to use tie lines for your split. So make sure that that's what you're using if you want to make use of gain sharing. It also needs to be enabled in the IO port menu. So once you have your actual hardware configured properly, you have to go under Mix Rack, Audio, and IO port. And this is the menu where you'd kind of access the settings for the cards that are installed. So certain cards have additional settings that you can modify within the DLive. And in this case, you'd go to IO port, and if you have a Giga Ace card installed and everything is configured properly, then you can enable gain sharing, and that will automatically enable it on the other console as well. And you also have an option here to enable scene safes for your preamps, your remote preamps, because if you're cycling through scenes on one system, you don't want like these sudden jumps in gain on the other system. So basically, when you enable safes, you're saying that, okay, when I recall scenes, I want everything to recall except for the preamps on any remote preamps that I'm sharing with the other system. And so here's an example of how that would be set up. So remember, before DLive version 1.9, if you have a digital split like this, you would just kind of set up tie lines, you would send that over to the other system, and then this system would just be working with digital trim. That's all they could do. But now, thanks to gain sharing, this surface here, even though it's not directly connected to this mix engine, you can actually control the actual preamp gain on these mic preamps on this DM64. So that's a really cool feature that Alan Heath has added. And it's important to note that gain tracking and gain sharing are not mutually exclusive. You would still use gain tracking under these circumstances. So you have gain sharing between the systems, and you can also turn on gain tracking so that if this surface makes an adjustment to one of these socket preamp gains, that the trim compensates on this other surface to make sure that the mix is not affected. And there's another method of using gain sharing. So if you don't necessarily have the exact hardware required, you don't have two DLives or two Giga Ace cards, you can also use gain sharing with our DT stage boxes. So if you're not familiar with these, there's two versions. There's the DT168 and DT164W. And what's cool about these is that they don't communicate back with the console over S-Link or Giga Ace or DX. They use the Dante protocol for talking back to the console. So you would need a Dante card installed in your console in order to receive the audio. And prior to these stage boxes existing, the Dante cards installed in our consoles would just receive audio, and that's it. You can receive and transmit audio. But once these DT stage boxes were added to the lineup, you can now also send preamp control data over Dante. So once you set up everything properly, and that involves first making the patch in Dante controller, because these are all Dante devices. So you have to make the patch between, say, your DT168 and your SQ Dante card, and your DT168 and your DLive Dante card. If you make those patches and then you assign those incoming Dante sockets to input channels, then you'll see that you both have access to the preamp controls on these DT168 preamps. And so if a change is made on one console, you'll also see that change happen on the other console. So it's essentially gain sharing using these DT stage boxes between two systems. And what's cool about this is that you don't, like I said, you don't need the perfect configuration. You don't need two DLives. You can use a wide range. You could use SQ, you could use Avantis, you could use AHM and DLive, and you can mix them all together, assuming you're compatible. One thing I'll note is that if you have the old M Dante card, the 48K version that was from our iLive and GLD series, those are, they are compatible with DLive and Avantis if you use the adapter, but they don't offer that preamp control of DT stage boxes. So make sure that you have compatible cards if you want to run a system like this. And also make sure that all your firmware is updated, because these stage boxes have firmware, these cards have firmware, and the console has firmware. Make sure everything is up to date on the latest version in order to get proper preamp control and have everything working properly. And the firmware is updated on these through the DT preamp control software. And so that's kind of cool also, is that you can control the preamps on these using a computer software. So you don't even need an Allen & Heath mixer with a card installed. If you just want to kind of use this as your audio interface in a studio, you could set this up with DT preamp control, and you can adjust the preamp levels and patching and update the firmware and so on. So here's an example of how you could set that up. So in this case, look, we have an SQ with the SQ Dante card and an Avantis with this DLive or Avantis Dante card. And they're both connected to a DT stage box. In this case, the DT stage box is configured in switched mode. And what that means is that the primary and secondary Dante ports on this DT can actually go to two separate places. It acts like a network switch. And so the primary port is going to this SQ. The secondary port is going to this Dante card, which is actually the wrong port. This is the network port. It should be going here, but just ignore that. But yeah, so in this case, if the SQ controls the gain on one of these preamps, the Avantis will also see that, because they're both accessing the preamps directly through this Dante network. And here's another cool example. This is something you can't do with standard DLive gain sharing that we looked at earlier. That gain sharing with DLive is just between two systems interacting with each other. With Dante, and because Dante is kind of a more flexible protocol, you can have three consoles all sharing the preamp gain on a single DT stage box or multiple DT stage boxes, as long as everything is configured properly. But one thing to note in this case is that Avantis and DLive both support gain tracking. So if a change is made on the preamp gain, the trim can compensate to not affect your mix, but SQ does not support gain tracking. So you have to make sure that whoever's using the SQ is aware if you're going to make a change to the gain from another system, so that they know to compensate with trim or adjust their mix or whatever it is. Okay. Any questions? That concludes our lesson on gain sharing, gain tracking. Any questions about any of that? Feel free to unmute yourself or put in the chat.